Unit 11, from the offer to the closing. The sale of real estate involves three separate sales. The first would be selling the owner on making a listing or selling the property. The other would be representing the buyer in the purchase of that property. The second would be selling the buyer on making an offer. And the last would be selling the seller on the acceptance of the offer. And if you can't get to this one, meaning the third one, selling the seller on the acceptance, then we have a failure. Property doesn't transfer, no commissions are paid out, and move on to the next deal. Once you have your offer signed, it's time for an appointment. And at this appointment, you're going to present your offer. So the first person you would call is the listing agent. I would never contact the owner, always go through the other agent to set the appointment. And let them know that you'd like to come and present your offer. Now, I personally have done this and sat at a kitchen table with the other agent and the seller and presented the offer. And I thought it was very effective to talk about rationale, find out what the other side is really looking for. And it was a real good business situation where we got something done. And in my case, we did get the offer accepted. Once you're setting up your appointment, avoid giving any details over the phone. You want to sit down in front of them and present your offer because there could be some intricacies of the offer that really need to be explained. If you do give too many details, you may get an owner that rejects the offer just over the phone because they'll probably drill down to the purchase price. What's the purchase price? Here's what it is. I'm not going to accept it. Goodbye. You don't want to do that. I should say, too, that in a typical market today, what I've done in the past is sit down at the kitchen table and present the offer. I have to tell you, most people don't do that. We're in an age of the internet and email, and most people will go through their software and email the offer for acceptance over to the seller's agent. And the seller's agent normally will present the offer to them, and then you'll hear back either by an acceptance or a counteroffer. As you're at your meeting too, one of the things you want to have with you is your estimated seller proceeds or your net sheet. Really important because you may be coming in, as I did in one circumstance, and bottom line, I netted the seller the same price. But what I was doing is representing somebody I was doing a loan for. This was a friend, so I was donating my commission. So that 3% I was taking off the sales price and giving it to the benefit of my client, who was actually the buyer, and my client for a loan. So even though I came in with 3% less than the seller was expecting, I let them know by way of the seller's net sheet that he was going to net the same bottom line because I was basically crediting my commission toward my client. So net bottom line was the same to them and they accepted the offer. Depending on what the market is doing in that area, if prices are falling, you may want to bring in another CMA to reflect the current conditions, what homes have recently sold, and make sure that the seller is up to date and up to speed on what the market is actually doing around them. If you're in a multiple offer situation, you should do it in a non-prejudicial manner, meaning you need to present these offers logically to your client, the seller. As a listing agent, with permission of your client, the seller, you need to inform all agents that you're in a multiple offer situation and they should bring in their highest and best offer. Once the offers are in, you can let those buying agents know that you're going to review on a certain date and the offers have to be in, say, at 5 o'clock on Saturday, at which time you're going to review those offers with the seller and you'll get back to them accordingly. What's nice to do that I've experienced also is go through those offers with the seller, but also maybe make it a little easier on the seller too by doing a spreadsheet and listing some of the benefits, the sales price, down payments, earnest money deposit, and so on to see how strong each offer looks or not strong. But anyway, at that point, you can go through all the offers with a seller, but you have something in the way of a spreadsheet to just quickly do an overview of the offers that have come in. if you're presenting the offer in person, you need to really set the mood of the presentation. Um, Make it casual, make it friendly, but it's a business situation. So you want to sit physically close to the owners as you can, or across the table from them, so you can have eye contact. Let them know about your buyers and what they've been looking at in other properties, and give them reasons why the owner's property won out over the competitions, why they want to purchase that property. As you prepare to submit the offer, there are some steps you should take for the presentation. Sort of go over the history of the sales effort, including the time on the market and all other marketing efforts. Maybe you even want to go and talk about the buyers and what they've went through and how that led them to that particular time at that kitchen table to present their offer. You should also humanize the buyers. Let them know the people that are making this offer. And they're not just names, they're people with a family. Even have a written short bio you can leave with the seller so they can have sort of a connection with those buyers who are making the offer, humanize it. And then the offer itself, that's next. As you get started and start the conversation, gain acceptance and start the conversation on little points before discussing price, because it could be a short conversation as you're going in with a lower price than the listed price. So do that first and start generating a conversation. If you are coming in at a lower price, justify the offer. Of course, you'd have your comps with you and recent sales to justify what you're offering and why your buyers feel like they're making a legitimate, fair priced offer. Three things or a number of things can happen after the offer is presented. There can be an acceptance, meaning we have a contract now between buyer and seller to move forward through the purchase process. There can be rejection. Maybe if somebody comes in with a real low ball, maybe somebody who's a flipper comes in and says, I'll give you all cash, but I'm going to be $150,000 lower than what you're expecting. Or you can have a counteroffer, which is not a contract. You're basically back to the offer situation again, only this time it's a seller coming back to the buyers to say, I'm countering your price or countering some other specific that's in the contract. Or it could be a multiple offer situation where everybody's notified to say, come in with your highest and best offer. We're considering all offers by Saturday at 5 o'clock. And you may do a multiple counter offer at that time where you're countering back maybe 3 to 4 people who have submitted offers to the seller. If reasonable, an agent can make a recommendation on acceptance. If it's within the parameters of what the sellers were looking for, it's within their right to go ahead and recommend an acceptance. Most offers that come within 30 days of the listing, and normally your first few offers are probably the best offers you're going to get. As time stretches out and it goes beyond those 30 days, the offers tend to come in less than what you've seen in the first few offers that have come in the first 30 days. An agent can also recommend a counteroffer. If the agent believes that it's not in the principal's best interest to accept that offer, so they're not accepting, so they don't have a contract at that time, but the seller is actually doing sort of a new offer back to the buyer. Hey, I've read your offer, I respect it, thank you very much, but let's go with this sales price or these other specifics to the contract. The agent can also recommend that the seller not only not counter offer on this offer, but may also recommend that it be declined or not accepted. Once again, if it's a flipper coming in and they're coming in all cash for $100,000 low, the seller's agent knows what things will sell for in the area, and they can encourage the seller to say, hey, let's just wait on here. We're in early stages of our listing. We'll get this sold. We don't need to look at a flipper's cash offer at this point. When the owner wants to make a counter offer, what the agent feels is a good offer, or when the owners want time to make a decision, the agent should discuss what buyer's remorse is, meaning, are these people going to have second thoughts? Should we make a stronger consideration of their offer right now? We'd hate to have them set back over the weekend and start thinking, get buyer's remorse and maybe want to back out of the deal. So let's go back to square one. Let's look at the offer and see where it makes sense. Let's go and look at that net sheet again and see if this offer makes sense to you. Once again, with a counter offer or a delay, it may give a buyer a chance to look further. And you really don't want to do that. You want to keep them in a position where they're about to enter into a contract with you. Um, by acceptance, you obligate the buyer to a contract with you. Doesn't mean you have to close, because you still have contingencies you have to go through before you're ready to purchase the property. But you actually created a contract at that sales price between buyer and seller. A buyer's agent does have some fiduciary duties to the seller. You have to be absolutely honest. You can never participate in any of the buyer's fraudulent schemes. You need to be truthful and open about fully explaining provisions of the offer, especially explaining unusual ones. And make sure that the seller knows that you are representing the buyer only. As a seller's agent, you have duties to the seller, of course, also because you have a fiduciary responsibility to your client. You need to protect the seller from fraud or shady offers where a buyer is attempting to take advantage of the seller. Be wary of unusual purchase forms. You should be using the standard California Association of Realtors forms or CAR forms. Be very leery of low earnest money deposits. You probably ought to get something, receive something, at least 1% of the sales price. Have raised some question marks if it's an exceptionally long escrow. Why can't you close within 30 days or 45 days? Why do you have to go out 120 days? And think twice about buyers attempting to cash at the closing, meaning they're looking at the seller's equity, which would reduce the net sheet if they're asking the seller to carry a second trust deed or do seller financing of the property. Be very, very careful with that and do some inspection and research on the buyer if that's what you're thinking about doing. Be very skeptical too if somebody comes in and is offering something other than cash to open the escrow, meaning the earnest money deposit should come in the form of a check that goes right into escrow. Bitcoins or anything like that, I'd be very, very leery of those and go traditionally, saying, you know what, we're going into escrow. I'd prefer a check. We'll deposit right into escrow. In fact, even say you don't want to use Bitcoins or anything like that. You prefer the cash is king theory, and cash is what you'll take, or you're advising the buyer to use his check and use cash to put in escrow for the earnest money deposit. Once again, be very leery about a subordination clause in the purchase contract, meaning if you're going to do a seller carryback, you're going to lend them money. Say the buyer's coming in with a first trust deed of $400,000 and you're going to carry a second trust deed of $100,000. Well, you don't know anything about the buyer as far as their credit worthiness, their source of funds, how much income they have. In this case, you're becoming a lender basically because you're lending some of the equity to the buyer to make that purchase. So you need to underwrite that seller carryback file to support your willingness to do that. I've even seen in circumstances where the seller has given permission to a lender to make a copy package and then give it to the seller for review, which would include credit report, bank statements, everything else, to give the seller some confidence that after close of escrow, the buyer will make payments to the seller on that second trust deed. Be really careful on exchanges too. If you're going to exchange, say, a house for another house or a piece of land for another piece of land, make sure those values are good. Do as much research as you can if you're going to do an exchange. In addition to, here's something you never do, because I've had experience or I've seen people do this and it always works out terribly. Do not ever allow a buyer to have possession of the property prior to closing. ever. Doesn't work out well, and if the closing doesn't go through, you're stuck with somebody living in that property, and then you'll have to go through an unlawful detainer to get that person out. If the offer presented is lower than what the seller is anticipating, sometimes you'll need to overcome the seller's price objections, maybe by showing the difference in the form of percentage, and also too bringing out those comps again too to show, hey, look, this is what the sales prices are going for right now. I think that's supported. Whereas you may look at it also to say they're only offering 3% or 5% below what the list price is. So I think it's a legitimate offer and we ought to consider it. What you're really seeing in that situation, if the seller's rejecting an offer, the seller's really bidding against the buyer. I think it's worth this and you think it's worth this. So one of the questions you may want to ask the seller too is, you're selling this house. If you were the buyer, how much would you offer for the property? So get some discussions going along those lines. But you want to avoid that situation where you're bidding against the buyer. And once again, use CMAs, show similar properties that have been recently sold to justify the lower price, if that's the case, if it's a reasonable offer. If there's a counter offer, the most common seller objections are normally price, of course, the amount of deposit, and if somebody's really a serious buyer for your property, they should come in with a legitimate down payment, or not down payment, but earnest money deposit. If they're coming in with $100, this person probably isn't real. You want to see somebody come in with a legitimate, strong, earnest money deposit. And also too, at the same time as the offer comes in, you want to ask the buyer's agent to provide source of funds from the buyer. Show a bank statement that you have the money to close. It'll show enough money for the earnest money deposit and also the amount of cash to close. There may also be some other conditions that the seller might not really want to consider, and those conditions might be buyer credit for closing costs or repairs in the property prior to closing. As the seller counters, he'll probably go back for a price increase, where at some point too, the next counter may be to meet in the middle somewhere. Say it's a situation where it's a $400,000 that was asked for the price of the property that the buyer's offered, and the seller's list price was 4.25. Well, maybe they meet in the middle, like 410 or 412. They may want more skin in the game from the buyer. They want to increase the earnest money deposit. They may want to limit some time as to other conditions. One of those conditions may be that maybe the buyer has a contingent sale. They need to sell their house before they can close on this property. One of the things to consider in that case is, is your house in escrow right now? That'll shorten the time as far as closing. You may also want to weigh out too, if they have a home to sell. You may want to put in your contract a 72-hour clause, which means I'm going to still market my house until your house is closed and we can continue with our contract. But in the case I get another buyer coming through, I'm going to give you 72 hours to perform, or you need to back out of the contract so I can proceed with another buyer. So this is the case where you want to limit time until the conditions are removed. In this case, it's a contingent sale. You also might want to counter back the seller as far as the seller's liability to any corrective work required, because the first thing the buyer is going to do once they have a contract is get their contractor to go through, and then they'll probably submit a request for repairs. With a seller, may want to go in and just say, this is an as-is property. I'm not doing any repairs. The price reflects the condition of the property. When you do a counteroffer, of course, it has to be in writing, and use a counteroffer form that's approved. Normally, it's a CAR form, California Association of Realtors. You use that to counter back. You don't want to say anything verbally or in a different form that might be confusing. Use the legitimate counteroffer form. In the counteroffer, the sellers may want to give up some concessions, maybe minor, just to show that they're open to negotiation and not that they're stubborn and they want to scare the buyer away. So maybe they want to give up directing who gets escrow or who gets title. But a small win for the buyers may go a long way. The acceptance must be unqualified, or it will be regarded as a counteroffer. You can send it by either fax or email, and it does not take place until the offeror is notified of the acceptance. So it can be signed by the seller and acknowledged, but it's not an acceptance until the buyer is notified. The agent's duties are not completed until the escrow closes, so you're still on the clock. One of the things you should do is contact your client at least once a week. And I would also say too that if you have other stakeholders or partners that you're using in the transaction, you should probably have them follow up with the client also. For example, if you have a lender, your lender should contact the buyer once a week to let them know how their loan process is 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 proceeding. In addition to, you may want to contact, say you're a buyer's agent, and you get that information from the lender. Your agent might want to forward that on to the listing agent also and let them know, hey, we're on time, appraisal's done, came in at value, we have underwriting approval, we will be closing on time. Or have your agent ask the other agent, would you like my lender to contact you periodically and let you know how the loan is proceeding? It's really important to keep everybody updated as far as the status of the transaction. Here's a sample checklist for closing. First thing an agent needs to do, and this is a seller's agent, is provide the information or open the escrow with the earnest money deposit and the purchase contract. And if you're doing separate escrow instructions, make certain they're all signed by all parties. One thing you might want to do with something like this too, as far as to help you with your checklist, is use a transaction coordinator to help you make sure all the disclosures are in, all the paperwork signed, and everything is submitted to escrow for the transaction. Make certain that if you're getting a pest control, a structural pest control inspection, that it's ordered right away. And make sure that the lender has a loan being processed, that it's been submitted to underwriting, that it's credit approved already. If there was an appraisal, get that appraisal ordered as soon as possible. And likewise on the listing agent side, make sure the contractor gets out as soon as possible. So during your discovery period, you can investigate the property if you're the buyer. Also, you should keep in touch with the lender to make sure everything's moving on time. On the other hand, if you're a good lender, you should be contacting the agents and letting them know, hey, the appraisal is ordered, I have credit approval. So communication is the key to getting transactions done smoothly. You need to communicate with the buyer and seller on a weekly basis as to what's being done. Immediately notify the buyer or the seller of any problems that arise and what will be done to correct those problems as soon as possible. If there is, and I should say when there is a walkthrough inspection prior to close, be there for the walkthrough inspection because they're discussing the condition of the house that's soon to be transferred, and you need to be there involved in those discussions. Make sure that you have all the keys labeled and are left behind, garage door openers, as well as the appliance manuals, warranties, and other openers to make sure that as the people walk through, they can operate their home and move in. And after closing, always do this. Thank all parties. Make sure it's a pleasurable transaction and you appreciate the hard work that all parties have put into making it a smooth transaction.